Good morning. Welcome to Bible study. Today will be a little bit different because we finished book of Malachi last week. So the plan today is to talk about this time in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The theme today is about Alexander the Great and the Greeks and how the Greek culture impacted the time of the New Testament. So today I would like everybody to have a paper copy of the Bible. So could somebody help me and just grab a few copies and let's hand those out?
There's no difference in color?
Let's take the maroon ones. They're bigger print. Let's begin today with a prayer. Lord, you're the one ruling and shaping all of history, and today as we see how you brought somebody onto the scene that was totally unexpected, and yet you also predicted him. Pray that you'd bless us as we see how you use the Greek culture for the building up of your church and the spread of the gospel. So bless our study this morning together. Amen. I think Alexander the Great is just fascinating. I think it was in grade school. That was like my research project. And I read this book that was way too thick, and I don't remember most of it. But just, part of me likes the military battles and the fact that this kid, conquered the world. He was 20 years old when he became the king, and he died when he was 33. And in the span of that 13 years, he completely conquered the Persian Empire and marched with an army all the way to India. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about him this morning, and then I want to give you 3 ways this impacted the New Testament, because the big goal is, as we talk about this period in between Old Testament and New Testament, that you realize some of the background that'll help you as we get into the life of Christ then into the New Testament. We don't know exactly what he looked like. Here's where we're going. So today is Alexander the Great. Next time the Maccabees. Then talking about what the Apocrypha is, the Roman Empire, Herod the Great. Gives us 5 weeks before we break for the summer. We don't know exactly what Alexander the Great looks like. This is the picture that's usually used. It's a mosaic that was done about 200 years after he was alive. And so how much the artist knew what he was like, he's the guy on the horse on the left. He's fighting against the Persians. So if you zoom in on that part, that's how Alexander the Great looks in this mosaic. Riding on a horse, he did have a horse that he loved, named it, all that. He would have been a young man in his 20s as he's fighting this battle. So maybe something like that, although I don't know if we know that for sure. I was talking to Mary Lou. You said that on Netflix they've got a Alexander the Great thing you can watch that's kind of documentary, kind of like actors acting it out.
Documentary, but they'll say something about it and then they'll play the story with the actors. It's pretty good.
Wikipedia, you have to always kind of read that with a grain of salt because there are a lot of people contributing and someone might have put something in that was wrong. I think it's a good place just to get an overview on stuff. So here's just the opening. Again, they use that as the main picture for him. Here's the first paragraph. Alexander III of Macedon, and then it gives his dates. So he was born either the 20th or 21st of July, 356 BC. Died on the 10th or 11th of June in 323 BC. So didn't quite get to his 33rd birthday. Most commonly known as Alexander the Great, was a king of the ancient Greek kingdom of Macedon. He succeeded his father Philip II to the throne in 336 BC at the age of 20, and spent most of his ruling years conducting a lengthy military campaign throughout Western Asia, Central Asia, parts of South Asia, and Egypt. By the age of 30, he had created one of the largest empires in history, stretching from Greece to northwestern India. He was undefeated in battle and is widely considered to be one of history's greatest and most successful military commanders. Beyond that, you could read the whole article or whole books on him. But the main facts about his life, he starts out as the son of the king of Macedon. The first thing he did then was to unite the Greeks, because the Greeks always had a bunch of these little tiny city-states. You've got Athens, you've got Sparta, you've got Corinth. And for a lot of their history, they just spent all their energy fighting each other. There were some times when they were able to unite. When we were reading the book of Esther, we talked about how the Greeks were able to fend off the Persian invasion during the time of Xerxes. The Battle of Marathon, and why we still run marathon races today, is from that Greek and Persian battle. There was a major naval battle where the Greeks destroyed the Persian fleet. And that allowed them to remain independent and not fall under Persian rule. So the Greeks hated the Persian guts, and so when Alexander the Great unites them, and his goal is to let's go take out Persia, that's the Greeks trying to settle some pretty ancient scores, and so the Greek army is going to come out of Greece and then head east. So in my Bible maps, I've got one that has this map that says the Greek Empire, Alexander and post-Alexander. And I think that's a pretty good one for what we need to talk about here. Let me zoom in on the western half of that. So if I say Macedonia, what part of Greece is that? The northern part of Greece. The southern part is called Achaia in the New Testament. So even if you're reading the book of Acts, it'll still talk about Macedonia being the northern part of Greece. So that's where Alexander the Great's from. His dad's the king there. They had some metal mines like silver and gold, and that's how they were able to fund this military campaign, is they've got some money from mining. Alexander's able to unite the Greek people, and then they head east. If you look south, this map doesn't call the southern area Achaia. What's the name for the purple area? Can you read that? Hellas. Keep that in mind, because that's the Greek name for Greece, is Hellas. And that'll play into the name for Greek culture that spreads around. So Alexander's first step is he unites that, and then the blue arrow now, they take their army east, they cross over the Bosporus into what's Turkey today. There's a battle at the Granicus River. But then if you go over, this one shows two more battles. There's one at Issus in 333. That's the one kind of in the middle. There's a battle at Gaugamela 2 years later. Between those two battles, he conquered the Persian army. And people debate whether he was just a great general or how much had the Persian Empire fallen into decline and no one really knew it. Sometimes big empires, people think they're strong and they're not. Really two major battles, and that's all it took for Alexander to just run all the way throughout the whole Persian Empire. In between those 2 years, where did he head, if you follow the arrows? He wanted to go to Egypt, and where's that going to take him past? Israel and Judah and Jerusalem. And so this is where Alexander the Great runs into the Jewish people. Again, this is after the time of the Old Testament. We're about 100 years or so after the time of Nehemiah. But still there's a high priest in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a little area in the Persian Empire. Alexander heads south. He's won one major battle against the Persians. but it's not for sure that he's going to win the whole war. And so as he heads south, all these little cities have to now decide who are they going to be loyal to. Are they going to remain loyal to the Persian Empire, or are they going to side with this new upstart king who's got this little army coming out of Greece? A lot of them resisted him and said, we don't think he's actually going to win. That was just a fluke that he won that big battle. So if you go down the coast, the red circles around town show where he laid siege to a city. And the one north, I know it's kind of small print from where you're sitting. What city did Alexander the Great conquer? Tyre and the Phoenicians. Tyre was out on an island. He actually filled in the ocean and built a causeway so he could have his army actually go out to Tyre. And if you read some of the prophecies of like Ezekiel, some of that is being fulfilled now as the city of Tyre that seemed to be, no one could conquer it because it was on an island. Alexander the Great was able to lay siege to Tyre and conquer it. He heads south. Another city that put up resistance was Samaria. That one, I'd have to read more about that one. The other one I know from history is Gaza with the Philistines. And I think like he crucified lots of people and he was not nice if you resisted him. He's trying to conquer everything in his path. He comes to Jerusalem, and he said Jerusalem is not circled here. As far as we know, Jerusalem opened itself up peacefully to Alexander the Great. The resource from this time is a man named Josephus, who lived just after the time of Jesus. He wrote a history for the Romans that covers the whole Old Testament period and the time in between and the time of Jesus. And so he can be really interesting to read because he actually talks about stuff that we don't have a lot of other records for. Trouble with Josephus, and why I haven't read him a lot, is he's really long-winded. And you have to have some patience to just allow him to say everything he wants to say. Other problem with Josephus is he's writing at the time of Jesus or a little after, so about the 70s AD. So how many years is he writing now after the time of Alexander the Great? About 400 years. And so the other question is, how much is he accurate with the stories that have been passed down to him? Some of it he perhaps is filling in the gaps, and he says this person said this or that. It might be him trying to write a complete story where he doesn't have all of the facts. But if you'd go to Josephus, he's got a section that talks about when Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem. His book is called The Antiquities. And kind of like the Bible, there are chapters and verses. So in my Bible program, I've got a copy of Josephus' Antiquities. We're looking for Antiquities 11, 329 to 339. Here's a taste of Josephus' writing style and the account of when Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem. The he, starting this off, is the high priest in Jerusalem named Jaddua at the time. The way Josephus tells the story, when Alexander was putting Tyre under siege, he asked the people of Jerusalem to send him troops to help defeat Tyre. And at that time, the high priest said, I'm not going to fight against the Persians. Didn't say, no, I don't like you, I'm going to fight against you, but he said, we're not going to help you. All of a sudden now, Alexander conquers Tyre, and he's marching south, and he's mad that Jerusalem did not help him like he'd asked for. So here's where the story picks up. Then when he, the high priest in Jerusalem, understood that he was not far from the city, talking about Alexander, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of the citizens. The procession was venerable, and the manner of it different from that of other nations. It reached to a place called Sapha, which name, translated into Greek, signifies a prospect, for you have thence a prospect both of Jerusalem and of the temple. And when the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans that followed him thought that they should have liberty to plunder the city and torment the high priest to death, which the king's displeasure fairly promised them, the very reverse of it happened. For Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priest stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the golden plate on which the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself and adored that name, and first saluted the high priest. The Jews also did all together with one voice salute Alexander and encompass him about, whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done, and supposed him disordered in his mind. However, Parmenio alone went up to him and asked him how it came to pass, that when all others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews. To whom he replied, I did not adore him, but that God who hath honored him with that high priesthood. For I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, when I was at Dios in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea thither, for that he would conduct my army and would give me the dominion over the Persians. Whence it is that having seen no other in that habit, and now seeing that person in it, and remembering that vision and the exhortation which I had in my dream, I believe that I bring this army under the divine conduct, and shall therewith conquer Darius and destroy the power of the Persians, and that all things will succeed according to what is in my own mind. And when he had said this to Parmenio, and had given the high priest his right hand, the priest ran along by him, and he came into the city, and when he went up into the temple, he offered sacrifice to God, according to the high priest's direction, and magnificently treated both the high priest and the priests. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended, and as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present, but the next day he called them to him, and bade them ask what favors they pleased of him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers, and might pay no tribute on the 7th year. He granted all they desired, and when they entreated him that he should permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws also, he willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. And when he said to the multitude that if any of them would enlist themselves in his army on this condition, that they should continue under the laws of their forefathers and live according to them, he was willing to take them with him. Many were ready to accompany him in his wars. Other reason it's hard is that the translation I have is like from 100 years ago, and I never use the word thither. But this translation does.
What's the original language?
He would have written, I think, in Greek. Yes, it's Greek. Even though he's writing to the Romans, part of what we'll talk today is that Alexander and the Greeks had such an influence on the world that Greek becomes the language that's spoken at the time of Jesus everywhere. So Josephus is writing this in Greek at the time of the fall of Jerusalem. So if you were able to put up with that and follow along, what are some of the main things Josephus says about when Alexander came to Jerusalem?
He worshipped God.
He worshiped the true God. Why?
He had a vision.
The claim is that Alexander had a vision, and what happened in this vision that Alexander had? The God says, I'm going to have you conquer the Persians, and he says, go right now, don't wait, just go. What did he see that he connects when he gets to Jerusalem?
Procession.
In his vision, supposedly what he saw matched with the garments the high priest wore when he came out of Jerusalem to meet him. So with Josephus again, how much of this is true? Other thing I think is interesting is what did they show Alexander when he came to Jerusalem? So rather than fighting him, they dress up for a religious ceremony. Everyone's in white. They open the gates. They go out to welcome him. They bring out a scroll. Which scroll do they bring and read to him? Daniel. And what do they show him in Daniel, supposedly? Daniel had predicted that the Greeks were going to conquer the Persians. Now, if you know the book of Daniel, there are a number of visions that Daniel saw where there are animals in them. So there's a lion that very much seems to be the Babylonians. Then the lion is followed by a bear who has ribs in its mouth. That seems very closely to line up with the Persian Empire. And then comes a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. And if you keep reading in Daniel, this is where people critical of the Bible today will say that Daniel must have been written after the time of Alexander the Great, because there's no way that anyone could have predicted what Daniel did. If you say that Daniel wrote when the Bible says he did, in the 500s, he's predicting things a couple hundred years in advance, and part of that is that the Greeks are going to conquer the Persians. So whether or not that's true that they brought the scroll out, Josephus says that the people in Jerusalem showed Alexander the Great that his conquest had been predicted by the prophet Daniel. So what did Alexander do when he entered Jerusalem, according to Josephus? He worshiped God. He participated in sacrifices to God at the temple. And what did he promise the Jews?
They could live according to the laws of their forefathers.
They could follow the laws of their forefathers, so they followed the laws of Moses, and even he would give them the Sabbath year off from paying taxes. And if anybody wanted to join his army, they could join his army under those same conditions. Now, if you're with other people who say that sounds way too good to be true, it very well might be that that was not exactly how it went down. But going back to the map, it does seem to be a historical fact that Jerusalem was not put under siege, and Alexander the Great did not have to conquer Jerusalem as he went south. So that's going to play in now as the Jews are going to be part of a Greek empire now and not the Persian Empire following Alexander. Sally?
So you said that Josephus was writing a history for the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
What would be, I don't know this, that's what I'm wondering, is there a motivation for Josephus to lie about this?
That's a whole nother, I'm not an expert on Josephus, and to talk through how reliable he is or what kind of motivations he has. He defected to the Romans at the time when the Romans were attacking the Jews and destroying Jerusalem. His big motive is to put the Jews in a good light. That even though I think many of his contemporaries would have considered him a traitor, he's trying to portray the Jews in a way that the Romans will actually respect them and understand their rich history. So he does have an incentive to embellish things in a way that would make the Jews look good. Which is why I think people would say a story like this, it sure makes the Jews look good compared to the people around him. The sections before and after, he's no friend of the Samaritans. So there are other stories about the Jews and Samaritans in this intertestamental period, and the Samaritans in Josephus are not put in a good light. So that'd be part of it. The other thing would be, I think he has an incentive to fill in the gaps, where if he's writing a history and he says, I don't know, that doesn't make him look good. And so could he be filling in some gaps to have a complete story, even though he doesn't really know that for sure?
So he himself knew about the prophecy in Daniel, and he could have just filled in the gaps.
I think by the time of Josephus, it's very obvious for anybody reading Daniel that the Greeks were predicted there.
Because, I mean, according to him, the high priest at that time was already showing Alexander the book and saying, hey, this is predicted to happen, and it looks like it's you.
And not just Alexander the Great. One of the final chapters in Daniel talks about the king of the north and the king of the south. We're going to talk about how the Greek Empire fractured into 4 parts. The Seleucids were in the north and Ptolemies in the south, and that chapter in Daniel is very close to what happened as those 2 Greek kingdoms are fighting each other, again, after the time of Alexander. So it's not a question of whether the book of Daniel talks about the Greeks. The question is, was Daniel written at the time the Bible claims it is? In which case, it's an amazing predictive prophecy. The critical response would be to say, no, you got to post-date Daniel later on, that he's writing about stuff he already knows happened in history. But
Daniel wasn't alive during this time, was he?
not the way the Bible, if you take the Bible at face value, Daniel lived at the end of the Babylonian Empire, beginning of the Persians. So if you take the Bible, what the Bible says about Daniel, Daniel was written about 200 years before Alexander the Great. Going back to this map then, or anybody else with a question? After that, Alexander goes down into Egypt. Again, there's such, religion is just blended into so much of life in the ancient world. So now he's with all the Egyptian gods, and I think you mentioned the documentary said that he considered himself a god, or his mother had told him that.
His mother told him that Philip wasn't really his father, that Zeus, the god of Zeus, was his father.
Part of Alexander, I think is interesting. I don't know how well would I have gotten along with him personally. He had a very big head. And you get down to Egypt, and he considers himself deified now in the manner of like the Egyptian gods too. But he's able to conquer Egypt. Then he heads back north, and now there's that second big battle where if there was any question before, like did the Persians just have a bad day? Can they regroup and now put down this major threat? He's able to win that second major battle 2 years after that first one. And then from there, there's nothing that stops him then from taking his army all the way east throughout the whole Persian Empire. He got all the way to India, past the Indus River, and finally the thing that stopped him is his Greek soldiers said, "We are so far from home, we didn't sign up to spend our entire lives fighting." So they mutinied against him, and he had to turn back because his army said, "We're not going to go farther." And it seems like, as great as he was at conquering things, he had no idea about how he planned to rule it. His big thing in life was just going and beating everybody. But as far as somebody who could try to manage what he'd conquered, like, he's a still 32-year-old kid. And his plan had been to go back and build some major administrative center in Babylon. But when he got back to Babylon, he died. And you could read, again, Wikipedia or other articles, or what was it that caused his early death. From what I know about him, he was the kind of guy who fought hard and partied hard. And that kind of party lifestyle and the amount of wine that he consumed was just astronomical. And his lifestyle ended up being his downfall. And he fought for those 10 years, had a couple years after that, and then died in Babylon at a young age. So he's conquered the entire Persian Empire, and there's no plan for what's going to happen next. And that ends up being the recipe for civil war now among his generals, because there is no one who is the obvious, here's the one person who's going to succeed Alexander. So over the next couple of decades, there are wars internally as they fight about who's going to actually rule this empire that Alexander's created. And that's where, let me go back to this one. This map has 4 colors, and if you look at the key, it says post-Alexander, there are 4 kingdoms. Purple is called the Hellenistic kingdom. Green is the Seleucid kingdom. Red is the Ptolemaic kingdom. Brown is the Antigonid kingdom. And again, I spent some time prepping for today. This is not an area I know just exactly backwards and forwards. Those are named, I think, after all of his generals. So there's a general named Ptolemy. There's a general named Seleucus. If you look at what areas they wanted for themselves, again, the homeland is Greece, and so 2 of them really wanted still to have control over Greece. They were willing to give up other areas to have control over the homeland. The rest gets divided in 2 parts. the Seleucids end up controlling most of what the Persian Empire had been, and the Ptolemies control Egypt. Now, if you look at how that's going to affect the Jews, where do they fall on this map? They fall with Egypt, but where are they not very far from? They're not very far from the Seleucids. And if you can kind of guess how the history is going to go, who's going to be fighting each other? The Ptolemies and the Seleucids now, even though they're both Greek empires descended from Alexander, these are now the world powers that are going to be fighting each other for the next couple hundred years. And the people living in Jerusalem are going to find themselves right in the area that tends to go back and forth between those two empires. So that's where there's a chapter in Daniel that talks about the king of the north and the king of the south. And the Ptolemies and Seleucids are going to be fighting each other. Next time, we're going to talk more about that because that's the background for the Maccabees and why the Maccabees revolted. The short story is that initially, they're under the control of the Ptolemies, who were fairly lenient in allowing the Jews to worship God. The Seleucids are going to gain control over Jerusalem, and there's a Seleucid king who's going to try to force the Jews to stop worshiping the true God, and that's going to spark a rebellion under the Maccabees. So if you want to read ahead about the Maccabees, that'll be for next time. So this map here is going to be the basic reality from about the 320s, 330s BC, for about the next 200 years. It's in the 100s that the Maccabean revolt happens. About 100 years after that is when the Romans come on the scene. So there is something about empires lasting about 200 years. The Persian Empire was about 200 years. And the Greeks, these four kingdoms, about the next 200 years, if you have this map in mind, this will take you from about the 300s BC to the 100s BC.
How many miles did he travel in 10 years?
Isn't that amazing? And the logistics of taking an army of tens and tens of thousands of troops all the way across. Ginny?
Aren't there the stories about him traveling with elephants?
Elephants would have been part of armies now where you don't hear that in the Old Testament, but especially as they're getting into India, that's where you've got you could source elephants out of there. So the Seleucid army in the future will have elephants. One of the Maccabee brothers dies by getting trampled by an elephant fighting in Judea. So, yeah, elephants will be part of it too. When we talk about the Romans, Hannibal fighting with the Carthaginians from northern Africa, fighting against the Romans, he brings elephants across the Alps into Italy. So, yeah, that's an aspect of warfare that doesn't show up in the Old Testament, but comes on the scene now in this time period. Let's keep going. I want to talk quite a bit about what impact this has. If there are three big things where this impacts the New Testament, it'd be these three. One is there's now more of a westward orientation for God's people. In the Old Testament, a lot of the focus is either south toward Egypt, from the perspective of Jerusalem, or it's north and east over toward Babylon. But now as we go toward the New Testament, all of a sudden, areas like Greece and Rome, even Paul's goal is to take the gospel to Spain. So you read the New Testament, and all of a sudden now, the land of Israel becomes kind of the eastern end. And as the Christian church spreads out into the world, at least in the book of Acts, it's this western push across the Mediterranean rather than an eastern push over to Babylon. Now, we don't have the accounts of all 12 apostles, and it could be very true that some of them went out south and east. But just as you go to the New Testament, there's more of we're looking west focused than there ever was in the Old Testament. And you think about how God's plan is working out and how my ancestors, as far as I know, would have been in Europe at the time, that the gospel is going to be taking a direction that's different from what the Old Testament believers would have expected. You read the prophet Isaiah and he talks about the islands as like the far-off place where we never go there and we have almost no idea who lives there. And the islands is talking about the Greeks. And so from the Old Testament perspective, the area on the other side of the ocean is this far away, we have never even been there land. But now all of a sudden that's going to be very much part of the world of God's people. Next one is something called Hellenization. Remember the name on the map for that southern area of Greece was called Hellas? There's the Greek word for it, Hellas. That's their own name for their land. So we call it Greece, but anything with Hellas or Helen at the beginning usually ties in with the Greek word for Greece. So Hellenization means taking Greek culture and spreading it all around. And this was very intentional. Starting with Alexander the Great, he thought that Greek culture was way better than everybody else's. And so this was not like it happened overnight, but it was a very much his goal and the goal of those who followed after him, that everything Greek would unite the world and spread because everything Greek is better. Another name for this that comes later is the term lingua franca. Is that if you look through world history, usually there's one language that becomes the language that's used if you want to travel around the world. The irony is, if you look at lingua franca, when that term was invented, what was the language that was universal?
Maybe French?
French. Was there a time when French was the universal language?
Napoleon?
At the time of Napoleon. There was a very narrow window when French was the language. What other languages do you know from world history have been the lingua franca?
Was it English one?
English is currently. So if you want to go around the world and speak to people, what language do you use? You learn English. Going back in time, for a long time, Latin. If you knew Latin, you'd be able to talk to anybody across Europe, even if they spoke another local language.
I would think Spanish is one too.
Spanish, I think, is because there's so many people that speak Spanish. So if you go back to the time of the Old Testament, like Aramaic became the lingua franca at the time of the Babylonian captivity, so that's why God's people start using Aramaic more. But now, with Alexander the Great, what's going to become the lingua franca? It is Greek. And this is very intentional, that if you want to do business across any of those empires, what's going to unite the world in how you speak? It's going to be that you use the Greek language. So when you get to the New Testament, and sometimes people are surprised the New Testament's written in Greek, but I think for the apostles, that was a no-brainer. Like, what language do we use? It's not like they debated that one. It's like, obviously, Greek is the language to use because that's the language to use if we're going to spread a message around the whole world. It'd be like if you were going to compose something today to go around the world, you probably would use English. Greek becomes that language. But it's not just the language. If you think about how American culture has spread around the world, what are some other aspects of America that, for better or worse, you'll find all over the world now today? Not just English. Fast food. So the idea that you put a hamburger patty and cheese on a bun and eat it, where do people do that now? Everywhere. It's not because it's some kind of like better quality food option than what other people have. It's just, that's part of American culture that has spread all over the world. Keep going.
Spam.
Some of our technology, better or worse. The internet.
No. I mean.
Oh, like spam in a can, like other foods. So spam in a can. I was thinking like the fact that there's junk email. What areas of the world has that impacted? And it's not just Americans who have invented that technology. I mean, was the internet more of invented over in the United Kingdom originally? But American technology companies have impacted the entire world.
There is a spam museum in Minnesota.
Austin, Minnesota.
The Heckmans told us about it, and when we went to South Dakota, we went there. It is fascinating. You can go there for hours.
Even as a kid who grew up there, I never felt like that was important enough. I've never been there myself. So I need to go there, huh?
Reagan Welke will tell you she was 10 at the time.
Other aspects of American culture, like Hollywood and how we make movies, that is imitated now all over the world. American styles of fashion and dress. Just the way that one culture can spread. That doesn't mean that local cultures don't keep their foods and their dress and their customs. But if you could imagine how American culture has spread, now take the same thing back to Greek culture after the time of Alexander. That very purposefully, they're going to spread Greek culture different places. And so this is going to be an issue for people who are Jewish. So do you know of some areas? What are some areas where if you are living as a Jewish believer in the period of Hellenization, that this will be something that is always a point of struggle?
Unclean food.
What you eat. So it's not that McDonald's spread around the world. It's Greek food has patterns of eating have spread, and that's not going to fit with the dietary laws of Moses. So if you are Hellenized, you pay less attention to the dietary laws. That's kind of ends up being the liberal position. Is, yeah, we eat like we're Greek. The more conservative people are going to say, no, we're going to not do that at all, and we're going to look down on the people who are Hellenized because we are going to hold on to the food laws of the Old Testament.
Is that how the different sects of Jews developed?
You're thinking right, because this is all going to impact the different groups of the time of the New Testament. In the Old Testament, often politically, it's do we support the Assyrians or do we support the Egyptians? But as you head toward the New Testament, a big dividing point among the Jews is, do you support Hellenization or do you push against Hellenization? That we want to keep our Jewish identity and culture and not allow this Greek stuff to creep in is a huge point of contention in Jewish politics. Other ones, so food would be a category. Religion, because Greek religion now is going to spread. How much do you worship along with the Greeks, or say I'll kind of mix both of them together, or how much do Greek practices start to impact how worship is carried out at the temple? That's another one. You know, we don't want anything Greek, is what some people are saying. Philosophy and thinking. It'd be a lot of the same categories as Americans today. Entertainment. So in the Old Testament, do they build horse racing tracks? No. Did they have one in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus? Yeah. Greek athletics spread around the world. So the idea of having Olympics. Anybody would know what the word gym means for gymnasium? Gym means naked in Greek, which is the Greek form of exercise, and you get guys together, and wrestling is, everything's done naked, and that offends Jewish sensibilities, and so if you're a Hellenized Jew, you would partake in that. If you're not Hellenized, like, can I participate in athletics when the Greek approach to athletics is different than what a Jew would do? That also exposes, it's very obvious if you're in a gymnasium, whether you're circumcised or not as a guy. And so that's going to be a cultural flashpoint too. They actually had a surgery where some Jewish men would try to undo their circumcision. If you can imagine how would you make that happen? But there are ways to try to make it look outwardly like you weren't circumcised, because our culture today, that's not something you ever would know about somebody. But in Greek culture, it becomes very obvious if you're circumcised or not. What other ones? Just the way you dress, architectural styles. Even today, you look at like our national capital, And what's the architectural style of the U.S. Capitol? It is some form of Greek revival, where you can go through and there are different types of columns and different types of headers on the columns. And if you've ever studied architecture, that's another branch of Hellenization and Greek architecture spreading. So again, if you are Jewish, this is going to irk you if you see buildings being built in Jerusalem that are built in what kind of architectural style? In Greek style. So as you get to the New Testament, this is a huge area of Greek culture has been purposefully spread everywhere and is taking over the whole world. Here's one example, Acts chapter 6. Talking about the early Christian church, in those days when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So this leads to them setting up Stephen and some others to help with food distribution. This is leading into the whole story about Stephen. But just incidentally in passing, it mentions these two groups. Why is there a conflict with food distribution in the early Christian church? There are two groups, and the people say it's not fair. One group is being treated differently than the other. And what's the dividing factor between the two groups? They're both groups of widows. It's not that they're Greeks. If you read carefully, they're all Jews. You've got a group that they have, people would be identified like this. You're a Hellenized Jew, you're a Hebraic Jew, depending on what culture you are living your life with. And in the city of Jerusalem, you actually have both of those groups at the same time. And it's enough of a divide that the Hellenized Jews feel like they're getting left out, that the preference, and maybe because the majority of the early Christians were from the more traditional, we're the Hebraic, we're not going to accept Greek culture type Jews. And so if you keep your eye out for it, this, how much should we allow ourselves to be Hellenized, is something all the Jews are going to wrestle with from the time of Alexander to the time of Jesus and beyond. There's one more big area I want to talk about, but anyone have a comment or question on that one? We'll talk later about Herod the Great, but again, like for Herod's reign, he wants to show that he's part of Greek and Roman culture, so in a way he's very Hellenized, but he has to be careful that he doesn't get too far away from what the Jews are looking for who are traditional. So even the rulers like Herod are trying to balance between we're Hellenized, we're not this backwoods rejecting the culture, but at the same time, we're not so liberal, leaving behind Judaic things that the people who want that are going to revolt against him as the king. All right, third big area is called the Septuagint. What the Septuagint is the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek because there are a lot of people, and including the Jews, who are using Greek as their main language. They're not fluent enough in Hebrew anymore for that to be their main language they use with the Bible. So I put the letters LXX under it because that's the Roman numerals for what number? 70. And Septuagint is the Greek word for 70. If we'd go back to Josephus, I feel like we're running out of time. Maybe once Josephus was enough. Josephus says that the history behind the Septuagint is that the Ptolemies in Egypt decided to build a massive library in Alexandria. And this is a real thing. Like, ancient knowledge was collected at this massive library in Alexandria in Egypt. The Ptolemies heard that the Jews had books that were very wise. And they wanted those, but they couldn't read them because they weren't in Greek. And so Josephus' story is that the king of the Ptolemies at the time released like 100-something thousand Jewish slaves that he'd taken captive in the wars, and then asked for the high priest to send him some experts in the Old Testament. They sent 72 men who went out on an island and were secluded, and in 72 days translated the whole Old Testament into Greek. Some of the stories say that they actually were in their own rooms and they each did it, and then they compared and they were all identical. So most people looking back again would say, this sounds like this has been embellished quite a bit. The real story, as far as I know, is that it was not a single point in time, and it wasn't just 70 men, that from a period of about 100, 150 years, probably sections that were used more often were translated first, but gradually the entire Old Testament was translated into Greek. If you look at it, it looks like there were a lot of different translators because sometimes they have very different translating styles, and they'll translate the same Hebrew words in different ways depending on which book of the Bible you're in. So rather than being a unified, all done at once, it probably was gradual, but this did come together as there is a translation called the Septuagint that was then used widely before the time of Jesus and at the time of Jesus and after the time of Jesus. So for sure, that's a word that you should know what it means and be ready when this shows up sometimes in your Bible. So let me give you some examples of how this is important. Open your Bible to 1 Chronicles chapter 1. So 1 Chronicles is in the Old Testament. At the end of the history sections. So you've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are the books of Moses, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. And then you got the 1st and 2nd. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In these maroon Bibles, we're on page 563. The black Bibles will be a slightly different page number. What's the page number on black Bibles? 340 if you've got a black Bible. Everybody there? I picked this not because it's so exciting, but because this genealogy is the kind of spot where there are differences in the different manuscripts we have of the Bible. And so as you say, what was the original 1 Chronicles chapter 1? What you do is you look at what do the different copies we have of 1 Chronicles say, and here's where the Septuagint is important. So look at the footnotes at the bottom of the page. Let's just take a look at the first note. The first note I have is in chapter 1, verse 4. There's a little letter A on my page. What line is it in verse 4? The line is the sons of Noah. There's a footnote. What does the footnote say and what does that mean? In the Hebrew copies of the Old Testament we have, that line isn't there. Why is that line in your English Bible then? The Septuagint has that line in it. So this Greek translation of the Old Testament is useful to say, what was the Old Testament like at the time of a couple hundred years BC? And then there are people who spend their life kind of, this is their specialty, is to look at what probably was there in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, that first half. Now, whenever you go through this process, I've heard it said, and this is true, none of these impact our articles of faith about what we believe about the Bible. Could you have that verse without that line in it and know exactly what it's saying? Sure. But as we want to hold God's words as careful as we can, it's going to mean comparing all the different sources we have. So read through some of those other footnotes. Most parts of the Bible are not like that, but a list like this, it's very difficult to transmit that perfectly the same every time. So here's where there are some differences among the different sources.
So the Septuagint does not have the line, the sons of Noah.
Other way around. The Septuagint has that line.
Oh, yeah.
Hebrew does not have that line. But most people today would say it seems like that was really there as this was translated. So then you'd have to think through how is it that that fell out of the Hebrew copies that were being. The next one I have with Septuagint is in verse 6. There's a name on the sons of Gomer. The name in question is which name? Riphath. Look at your footnote on that one. So the question is the name Riphath or is the name Diphath? Can you explain what the rest of the footnote says?
Hebrew manuscripts use diaphthong.
If you look at Hebrew manuscripts, you've got some of each. Most of them have Diphath, but it's not just a couple. Many have Riphath. And if you look at Hebrew, maybe you say, how are those get mixed up? The letter D and the letter R look very, very similar. So the question is, somewhere along the way, did somebody write the wrong letter to start the name, and they switched it from a D to an R? The English Bible here uses the name Riphath, and what's the reason for going with that, even though that's the fewer number of Hebrew manuscripts? See the Septuagint. You could also look back at a list of names in Genesis. The other one on the list is the Vulgate. What's that? It's not just the Catholic Bible. It's a Latin translation done by a man named Jerome. Many Latin translations were done off the Septuagint. So then you're secondhand Hebrew into Greek into Latin. Jerome actually moved to Israel and lived in Bethlehem and studied Hebrew in the 400s AD. And so his translation, the Vulgate, was better than the other Latin translations at the time, and the Vulgate became the standard Bible for not just the Catholic Church, but like Martin Luther growing up, anybody in Europe, the Vulgate was the standard. So Jerome, when he translates the Vulgate, he uses the letter R to start. So he must have been seeing something as he's using Hebrew manuscripts at his time, where it's the letter R to start the name and not the letter D. Now again, is this going to impact your faith? Not one bit. And part of me wonders, was this even worth the 5 or 10 minutes showing this to you? It's more as an example of, this is part of, as a pastor, this is something I had a class on in the seminary, is how do you work through these manuscript questions and weigh the evidence? The main things you're going to use are the Greek or Hebrew manuscripts, but sometimes there are translations that help you say, here's how you answer some questions about how the text was transmitted. And the Septuagint would be one area where that's really helpful.
I think it's good. Oh, I'm sorry. I think it's good because it argues against criticism that, oh, it wasn't translated correctly. This one says this one says this. Well, there's an explanation.
We have way more copies of the Bible than anything else. If you're going to question the Bible, you'd have to throw out, like, do we know what Plato wrote? We have way more copies of the Bible than we have anything copied from Plato. Or even like Julius Caesar wrote about his wars. There are very few copies of Julius Caesar's wars compared to what we have of the Bible. So the reality is, yes, there are discrepancies that got into the text over time, but by comparing all the manuscripts, this is where you can say this seems to be what was original, and even if there's a question there, none of them are going to change what we believe as Christians. But if you know the name Septuagint, keep that in mind as you read the footnotes in your Bible, because that name will show up, and often it'll be, here's why we're following this in this verse. It's because the Septuagint reads this, even if the Hebrew copy of the Old Testament doesn't have this word. Let's do another one. Romans chapter 9. Oh, we're already after 10. We should probably quit today. Can I come back and spend just a couple minutes at the beginning next time on this? So the Septuagint is also the Bible that Paul knows as an apostle. And as he's writing in Greek, sometimes he'll quote from the Hebrew and translate it himself. Sometimes he'll just quote from the Septuagint. And that'll play into how the Old Testament is then used in the New Testament, because that translation was so influential. So for next time, we'll finish up talking about the Septuagint, and then we'll look ahead at the Maccabees. For today, let's close with a prayer. Thank you, Lord, as we close, that you handed your word down to us. And I pray that we'd always treasure it and honor it and hold on to it, and you'd always guide us into knowing what you say to us. So please bless each of us as we go our different ways.